Boy laughs at old Navy officer stories, but then he learns he's a war hero. Amanda sat at her desk, sipping her coffee as the first light of morning filtered through the office windows. The hum of the fluorescent lights overhead and the soft clicking of keyboards around her were a soundtrack to her world. Predictable, structured, safe. Every morning was the same. The train ride was routine, the same crowded carriages, the same stop on Main Street, the same walk into the office building. She knew exactly what to expect when she entered the building. The polite exchanges with coworkers, the unspoken hierarchy of the office, and the never-ending flood of emails and meetings that marked her day. Everything was in its place, just the way she liked it. Before we can continue, if you support veterans, subscribe to this channel to help up creating amazing stories. Now, let's continue. Her work as a project manager at a corporate consulting firm had become her identity. She had spent years climbing the ladder, proving herself in meetings, managing multi-million-dollar accounts, and impressing her superiors with her attention to detail and her ability to keep things moving. Success had always been her goal, and now that she had it, there was a comforting sense of finality to it. She had the job, the apartment, the life that many of her peers envied. She was admired for her ambition, respected for her accomplishments. She had the trappings of success, the lifestyle that others aspired to, and she felt, deep down, that she deserved it. Still, in the quiet moments when the noise of the office subsided, a small voice whispered that something was missing. Amanda had brushed it off for months, maybe even years. It wasn't that she was unhappy. She was, in fact, proud of what she had built. But there was an unease that lingered, a subtle dissonance that she couldn't quite place. It wasn't that she wasn't grateful for her life. She was. She was able to afford her own apartment in the city, travel on weekends to exotic locations, eat out at fancy restaurants, and indulge in small luxuries, things that many people would consider a dream. But the more she attained, the less she felt content. There were moments, fleeting and disconcerting, when she asked herself if this was all there was. Amanda had always been a planner, a strategist, someone who knew how to set goals and achieve them. She had ticked off boxes on her life checklist with the precision of a well-oiled machine. Graduate college? Check. Get the job? Check. Move up in the company? Check. Own a sleek apartment? Check. Date a successful, handsome man who admired her drive? Check. But after each achievement, Amanda felt the satisfaction fading just a little quicker. The sparkle of victory wasn't as bright as it used to be. It was as if there was something deeper she was yearning for, but she couldn't quite define it. She had never questioned the formula for success, until recently. It had all seemed so simple, so clear-cut. Hard work, ambition, results. Get noticed, get rewarded. And yet, as she sat at her desk one particular morning, it occurred to her that she had never asked herself why she had been chasing after all these things. Was it for her own fulfillment? Or had it all been a performance? Had she been chasing approval and validation from others, running after a series of external markers of success that would never truly satisfy her? It was a disturbing thought, one that she quickly pushed aside. After all, she was successful, wasn't she? What more did she need? She could go to the best parties, wear the best clothes, dine in the trendiest spots. Her life looked perfect from the outside. Her coworkers admired her, her boss thought highly of her, and her family was proud of the path she had carved for herself. Yet, when she allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection, she felt a gnawing emptiness, as if her accomplishments, despite their outward brilliance, didn't fill the deeper parts of her soul. One afternoon, after a particularly draining meeting with clients who were impossible to please, Amanda sat at her desk, the weight of the day settling heavily on her shoulders. She rubbed her temples and looked at the pile of reports in front of her. There was something about the corporate world, the endless cycle of projects and deadlines, that felt like a hamster wheel. No matter how many clients she satisfied, how many targets she hit, there was always more to do. More meetings, more expectations, more noise. She had learned to work hard, to deliver, to meet expectations, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't enough. And worse, she didn't even know what enough was anymore. Her phone buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. It was a message from her mother. "We're having family dinner this Sunday. You'll be there, right?" Amanda stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keys. Family dinner. It was the same every week. Her mother, her father, her younger brother, and Amanda all gathered around the table. She always went, of course. It was tradition. But lately, even those dinners had begun to feel like another thing on her checklist. She loved her family, of course, but it was hard to ignore the fact that the same conversations were had every week. How was work? How was the boyfriend? When was she going to settle down and have kids? Amanda had grown accustomed to the familiar questions and predictable answers. She would talk about her promotions, her latest project, the places she had traveled, and how everything was going well. Her family, though loving and well-intentioned, never seemed to ask her anything deeper, and she never volunteered it. What would she even say? "Actually, I'm not sure why I'm doing all of this." She had no idea how to explain the quiet unease she felt, how she felt as if she was performing a role she had never fully chosen for herself. She sighed and typed out a quick response. "Of course, I'll be there." The conversation ended as quickly as it had begun, and the silence returned to her office. As Amanda sat there in the stillness, a new thought began to form, something she had been trying to ignore for some time. She was living in a comfort zone, yes, but it was a comfort zone that no longer felt fulfilling. She was surrounded by the familiar, but something inside her was telling her that it was time to step beyond the boundaries she had created for herself. The question was, what lay beyond those boundaries? It was a question that sent a shiver down her spine, a question that felt both liberating and terrifying. Amanda had always prided herself on her ability to control her environment, to shape her life according to her vision of success. But now, for the first time, she wasn't sure what her vision was anymore. She had accomplished everything she had set out to do, but now the world before her seemed flat, lacking the depth it once had. That evening, after work, Amanda took a walk through the nearby park, hoping to clear her mind. The cool air brushed against her face, the evening sky stretching above her in hues of pink and purple. As she walked, her thoughts turned to the veterans she had seen at the charity event a few weeks prior, the men and women who had given so much, not for recognition or personal gain, but for something larger than themselves. The way they had carried themselves with quiet dignity, the stories they shared, their genuine humility, it had stayed with her. She had always admired them from a distance, but now she couldn't help but wonder if she could ever live with the same sense of purpose and authenticity. What if all her achievements, all her success, were just a distraction from something deeper, something more meaningful? Amanda's pace slowed as she neared a bench by the lake. She sat down, taking in the stillness of the water and the rustling of the trees. She didn't have answers, not yet. But for the first time in a long while, she felt open to the idea of asking questions. It was a beginning, a quiet, subtle shift, a crack in the foundation of the life she had so carefully built. Amanda didn't know where it would lead, but she knew that, somehow, she was standing at the edge of something important. And, for once, she wasn't afraid to take the first step. Tommy Davis sat at the dinner table, his fork clinking against his plate, distracted by the low murmur of his grandfather's voice. It was the same routine every Sunday evening. His mom and dad were chatting about work, and his sister, Lily, was busy texting on her phone. But it was Grandpa Jerry's voice that drew Tommy's attention. And then we were pinned down behind the rocks, barely enough cover, the sound of the bullets. Tommy sighed and set his fork down. Grandpa was at it again. Another one of his endless war stories. Another tale about Vietnam, about heroism and sacrifice, about battlefields Tommy couldn't imagine, about comrades Tommy would never meet. Jerry had served in the Navy in the 1960s and early 70s, and ever since Tommy could remember, his grandfather had shared the same set of stories, repeated at family gatherings like clockwork. Each one was laced with heavy details, names of people, places, and events that meant little to Tommy, who had grown up in the quiet suburban comforts of his own world. The stories, though undeniably important to Jerry, felt dry and lifeless to him. Tommy didn't know how old he was when he first heard these stories, But they had started when he was still a child, long before he could understand the significance of what Jerry had gone through. Over the years, they had become background noise. There were endless stories about the missions Jerry had been a part of, the friends he'd lost, and the heroism he'd witnessed. But to Tommy, it was just the same old thing, Grandpa's face lighting up with passion as he retold tales of valor, of days spent in humid jungles, of navigating mine-swept waters, of narrowly escaping death on more than one occasion. Tommy wasn't moved anymore. At this particular dinner, his grandfather's words faded into the background of his thoughts as he idly pushed peas around his plate. He glanced over at his parents, both listening intently to Jerry's narrative, nodding occasionally, as though this was the most important conversation in the room. His mom shot him a look, and Tommy knew exactly what it meant. Pay attention. Show some respect. He did his best to mask his frustration and feigned interest, though his thoughts kept drifting back to the same questions. Why couldn't Grandpa talk about something more interesting? Why did his war stories always take center stage at family meals? Just as Jerry was recounting a particularly gruesome firefight, Tommy couldn't take it any longer. He had heard this one a dozen times. "Grandpa, this is the 4th time you've told us about that mission." Tommy blurted out, his voice cutting across the table. The words were out before he could stop them. There was an immediate, uncomfortable silence. His father's brow furrowed in warning, and his mom's face flushed red with embarrassment. But Tommy's eyes were fixed on Jerry, who had momentarily stopped talking, staring at Tommy in surprise. He realized, too late, that he had overstepped. "Tommy, that's not how we behave at the dinner table," his father said, his tone sharp but trying to keep the situation under control. "Apologize to your grandfather." Tommy's stomach tightened with guilt. He had always respected Jerry, or so he thought, but there was something about the way his grandfather seemed to live in those old stories that grated on him. It was as though Grandpa was still there, in the jungles of Vietnam, reliving moments that Tommy couldn't understand or appreciate. And it wasn't just the frequency of his stories that bothered Tommy, it was the way they defined his grandfather. Every family gathering seemed to revolve around them. Jerry had been a hero, a decorated officer with a past full of bravery, but Tommy couldn't connect to that version of Jerry. Jerry's face softened, and he sighed deeply, his eyes a little sad but not angry. "It's all right, Tommy. I know you've heard these stories a lot. But these are the things that kept me going back then. The guys who didn't make it, they didn't get to tell their stories, so I tell mine for them." His voice dropped, and for a second, Tommy saw the weight in his grandfather's eyes, the unspoken history that lingered behind the tales of valor and survival. Tommy felt a stab of guilt. He hadn't meant to hurt his grandfather, but he had just grown so tired of hearing the same words again and again. He was just a kid. He wanted to hear stories about adventure, maybe something that was happening now, something exciting that he could relate to. His mind wandered briefly to his favorite video games. He'd much rather be playing one of those than listening to another retelling of a war that felt so far removed from his own life. "Sorry, Grandpa," Tommy muttered, barely able to meet Jerry's gaze. "I didn't mean to be rude." The tension at the table lingered for a moment, but Jerry's gentle smile returned, and the conversation moved on. Tommy wasn't sure if his apology had been enough. His mind was still racing with frustration, and he couldn't stop thinking about the sheer monotony of it all. But that night, as he lay in bed, the lingering guilt gnawed at him. He couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to Grandpa's stories that he wasn't seeing, something important that he was overlooking. Later that evening, as he tried to fall asleep, Tommy replayed the night in his head. He had never really thought about why Grandpa told these stories. Of course, he knew Grandpa was a war hero. Everyone in the family knew it. He had seen the medals hanging in the hallway, the framed photos of Jerry in uniform. But Tommy had always assumed that Grandpa liked to talk about the past because he missed the glory days of his youth. Perhaps it was because Jerry had been a man of action, a leader, and now, as an old man, he didn't have the same excitement in his life. But the more Tommy thought about it, the more he realized how little he actually knew about Jerry. Sure, Tommy had heard about the things Jerry had done, the rescues, the battles, the dangerous missions. He had heard about his comrades, the soldiers Jerry had lost, the friends who never made it home. But Tommy had never really thought about what all of that had done to Jerry. What did it feel like to lose someone in the middle of a mission? What did it mean to return home after experiencing such tragedy? How did a man like Jerry carry all of that with him through his life? Tommy's thoughts began to shift. He realized that maybe there was more to his grandfather's stories than he had ever given credit for. Maybe they weren't just about the past. Maybe they were about something deeper. Maybe they were about the pain and the healing that came with living through something so monumental. Jerry's stories weren't just about war. They were about survival, about coming home to a world that didn't understand what you had been through. Tommy tossed and turned, his mind churning with new questions. He had always seen Grandpa's stories as boring and repetitive, but now he wondered if he had been too quick to dismiss them. Maybe he needed to listen more carefully. Maybe he needed to find out what Grandpa was really trying to say with those stories. The next morning, Tommy's parents sat him down after breakfast. His mom explained that, in a couple of weeks, they were going to visit Grandpa Jerry at his cabin in the woods for the weekend. Tommy felt a wave of resistance wash over him. Another weekend of boring stories, just like always. It was a nice cabin, sure, but it wasn't going to be much fun if all they did was sit around and listen to Grandpa recount his past. Tommy was already dreading it. But then something unexpected happened. As his mom spoke about the trip, Tommy found himself feeling something else, something he couldn't quite place. It was a curiosity, a faint tug in his chest, a wondering. What if he could hear something different from Grandpa this time? What if there was more to the stories than he had realized? He didn't know why, but he suddenly felt an urge to understand Jerry better, to hear those stories not just as tales of adventure, but as pieces of a much larger puzzle, one that might help him understand not only his grandfather, but his family's history, and maybe even his own place in the world. Tommy's curiosity had been ignited, and with it, a sense of purpose. This weekend, he decided he would listen to Grandpa more carefully. Maybe, just maybe, he would learn something he hadn't before. Kyle's discomfort deepened as the night wore on. The longer he sat in the bar, the more he realized how out of place he felt. The people around him were carefree, caught up in the ebb and flow of their own conversations, their own worlds. Their laughter was sharp, their chatter light. They had no idea who he was or what he had been through. They were untouched by the weight of loss, of duty, of service. He couldn't fault them for it. Why should they know? They weren't part of his world. But the longer he stayed in this unfamiliar space, the more it felt like that world was slipping further from his grasp. In the Navy, the bond between sailors was forged in shared purpose. It was a brotherhood built on trust and mutual respect, a camaraderie that transcended differences in background or personality. Even in the midst of grief, there was comfort in knowing that everyone around you had experienced the same things. There was a language and understanding that made communication seamless. A glance could say more than words. A silent nod could convey solidarity. That bond was something Kyle had grown to rely on, even if he never felt the need to vocalize it. But here in the bar, there were no shared experiences. No common language. Everyone seemed to exist in their own separate bubbles, navigating the world by their own rules. Some laughed as if nothing could ever go wrong in their lives, while others tried to make themselves heard over the noise, each voice competing for attention. Kyle couldn't understand how they did it, how they existed so freely, without the weight of responsibility, without the awareness of a greater purpose. There was something almost reckless in the way they navigated their lives, an ease that felt foreign to him. He wasn't one for deep introspection, but in that moment, Kyle couldn't help but question himself. Had he changed so much over the last few years that he no longer fit in with his old life? Was he destined to live forever between two worlds, never fully part of either? The Navy had given him purpose, discipline, and pride. It had shaped him into the man he had become. But now that he was back in the civilian world, those very things felt like burdens he couldn't escape. The uniform, the silence, the quiet pride, none of it seemed to matter here. In the civilian world, he was just another face in the crowd. Kyle glanced at the people around him once more, studying their carefree expressions, their casual interactions. They were drinking, laughing, and talking about things that felt trivial in comparison to the heavy responsibility he had carried for years. He had been part of something bigger, something that demanded sacrifice, hard work, and unwavering loyalty. But what did they know about that? They had no idea what it was like to give up so much, to face the reality of combat, to mourn the loss of a comrade. And Kyle realized, with a sinking feeling, that they probably never would. It wasn't that he resented them for their ignorance. It wasn't their fault that they hadn't lived through the things he had. But it still stung, the realization that no one here could understand him. The realization that the pain of loss, the weight of duty, had set him apart in ways he hadn't fully understood until now. The bartender returned to him with a fresh beer, and Kyle nodded in thanks, trying to shake off the sense of isolation that had settled over him. He took another sip, letting the cold liquid slide down his throat, and briefly closed his eyes. For a moment, it felt like a small release. Like maybe, just maybe, he could let go of the tension that had been building inside him ever since he returned to port. But even as he relaxed into the drink, he couldn't fully escape the discomfort. He wasn't sure what he was expecting when he came here. Maybe just a distraction, a brief respite from the reality of his life, but what he found was a reminder of how disconnected he had become from the world around him. The camaraderie of the Navy, the shared purpose that had defined his existence for so long, had no equivalent here. There was no bond, no unspoken understanding. There was just noise and chaos, a world that didn't require anyone to be anything other than who they were in the moment. Kyle tried to focus on the present, to drown out the ache of loss and the feelings of alienation. He looked around the room again, this time observing the interactions more closely. Some people were leaning in, whispering to each other, exchanging secrets and laughter. Others were lost in their phones, checking messages or scrolling through social media. It was a world of constant noise, of endless distractions that only seemed to pull people further from the truth of who they were, who they had been. For the first time in a long while, Kyle wondered if he would ever find his way back to a place where he truly belonged. The drive to Grandpa Jerry's cabin was longer than Tommy had expected. His parents, lost in conversation, barely noticed that Tommy had barely said a word. They had already talked about everything they could during the 2-hour drive, from the weather to work to Lily's dance recital. Tommy was thankful for the silence. His mind kept drifting back to the conversation at the dinner table the night before. His mother's words, the guilt of interrupting Grandpa's story, still tugged at him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. The air in the car felt heavier as they approached the cabin. It wasn't that Tommy didn't like Jerry or the cabin, it was just that, despite everything, he didn't know how to connect with Grandpa. How could he? They were from two entirely different worlds. Grandpa had lived through war, had been part of the Navy, seen things no one should have to see. Tommy's life was filled with Xbox games, school, friends, and the occasional summer trip to the beach. How could a 14-year-old boy ever understand a man who had witnessed the horrors of battle? As the car rumbled down the dirt road that led to Jerry's cabin, Tommy stole a glance out the window at the dense woods that surrounded the area. It was a quiet place, far from the noise of the city. The cabin itself looked small but cozy, nestled in the pines with a soft blanket of moss covering its roof. This wasn't a typical family vacation spot. It was a retreat, a place to escape, to unwind. But as they pulled into the gravel driveway, Tommy felt that familiar knot of uncertainty in his stomach. He was here for another weekend of Grandpa stories, and somehow, he knew it wasn't going to be as simple as the last time. Jerry, as always, was waiting on the porch to greet them. With his salt and pepper beard and the twinkle in his eye, he looked every bit the retired Navy man. He was dressed in a flannel shirt and old jeans, his weathered face framed by the setting sun. As he waved to Tommy, Jerry's smile widened, showing the warmth of a man who had seen much and lost much, but who still carried a spark of joy in his heart. Tommy's parents got out of the car and exchanged pleasantries with Jerry, but Tommy hesitated. For a moment, he felt like an outsider, like he was intruding on something he didn't understand. "Come on, Tommy. Don't stand out there all day," Grandpa called out, his voice as strong as ever. "I got your favorite cold drinks inside." Tommy smiled faintly, his hesitation slipping away with his grandfather's familiar tone. Still, there was a question that lingered in the back of his mind, a question that he had only just started to think about. What was it about Jerry's past that had made him such a complicated figure? Why was he always so eager to talk about things that Tommy couldn't relate to? What was the real reason behind those endless war stories? Inside the cabin, the smell of old wood and freshly brewed coffee greeted them. It felt like stepping into a different time, a different world altogether. The wooden beams overhead, the stone fireplace in the corner, the worn but comfortable armchairs by the window, all of it spoke of a man who had lived through much, who had seen things that couldn't easily be put into words. The shelves lining the walls were filled with books, framed photographs, and small mementos of Jerry's long, storied career. As Tommy unpacked his bag in the small guest room upstairs, he glanced around at the things Jerry had collected over the years. A model ship sat on a shelf, meticulously crafted, a small tribute to his time in the Navy. Next to it, an old map of the Pacific sat framed on the wall, its creases soft with age. Tommy's eyes fell to the corner of the room, where a tattered duffel bag lay. The zipper was slightly open, and for a brief moment, Tommy wondered what was inside. There was something about that bag, something that felt like a relic of a lifelong past. Tommy sat on the bed and took a deep breath. His heart was racing. He wasn't sure what he was expecting out of this weekend. Would Grandpa tell more of the same old stories? Or would something change? He had no idea, but one thing was for sure. He was ready to listen this time, really listen in a way that he never had before. After dinner that night, Jerry retired to his favorite chair by the fire, a glass of whiskey in hand, his eyes half closed in contentment. The fire crackled in the hearth, the light casting warm shadows on the walls. Tommy's parents settled into their own chairs, each of them content to let the silence stretch between them. Tommy, though, couldn't help but fidget. He couldn't shake the feeling that something important was about to happen. This was the moment. He was going to ask Grandpa something different. He was going to ask about the stories. "So, Grandpa," Tommy began, his voice breaking the quiet, "what was it like, in the Navy?" Jerry looked up from his glass, a slight smile crossing his face. He seemed to know what Tommy was getting at, but didn't push him. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, the firelight dancing on his face, casting deep shadows on his aging features. It was as though he was deciding how to answer, weighing his words carefully. "Well," Jerry said slowly, "it's not something you can explain easily. People think about the Navy like it's all about battles and glory, and don't get me wrong, there were some moments where you felt like you were doing something great. But that's just the surface." He paused, his gaze shifting toward the flames as if the memories of those years were resurfacing in his mind. Tommy leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. This was different. This wasn't the same old story about dodging enemy fire or saving a crew member. This felt like something deeper, something real. It wasn't just about the fights. It was about the people you met along the way, the things you shared with them. And then the hard part, Jerry continued, his voice taking on a heavier tone. The part that people don't talk about. The aftermath. The waiting. The not knowing if you'd ever see some of those guys again. He shook his head slightly, as if the weight of those words had suddenly become too much to bear. Tommy's stomach churned. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Tommy realized he had asked the right question. He wanted to know what it was like, not the action-packed heroism he had always imagined, but the real cost of war, the emotional cost. He wanted to understand the kind of strength it took to keep going when the fighting stopped. Jerry went on, his voice growing softer, but no less intense. There was a mission, one that changed me. It was early in my service. We were sent out to rescue a group of soldiers stranded on an island that was surrounded by enemy fire. It was the kind of mission where everything goes wrong, and you end up praying that you just make it out alive. Jerry paused, his eyes locking with Tommy's. You learn to make quick decisions, to trust the guys next to you more than anything. And when you lose someone, it's like a part of you dies with them. Tommy's chest tightened. He could see it now, clearer than ever, the man behind the stories. Grandpa Jerry wasn't just telling war stories. He was trying to make Tommy understand the bonds he had formed, the sacrifices made, the lives that were lost. Tommy had always seen the Navy as something distant, something he couldn't possibly relate to. But now, he could sense that it was part of his grandfather's soul. The Navy wasn't just a job, it was a piece of who Jerry was, a piece that had shaped him, broken him, and rebuilt him in ways Tommy had never imagined. That mission, Jerry continued, I lost men that day.
Good men.
But we made it through, and we brought those soldiers back. Some of those guys are still alive today. Others, well, they never made it out. He stopped, his eyes distant for a moment, as if lost in the memory. Then he looked at Tommy again, his gaze steady and intense. Tommy, I've carried those memories with me every day since.
They shape who I am.
They've always been there, lurking in the background, and they always will be. For a long moment, Tommy didn't know what to say. The weight of Grandpa's words hung in the air like a thick fog. He felt like he had stepped into a world he had never known, a world of loss, bravery, and survival that was so far removed from the video games and school problems that consumed his everyday life. There was nothing glamorous about war, nothing exciting. It was a world where lives were lost and sacrifices were made, and the people who lived through it carried the scars with them, whether visible or not. Tommy finally spoke, his voice quiet but steady. I had no idea, Grandpa. He paused, trying to find the right words. I never really understood before. But now, I think I do. Jerry nodded, his eyes filled with a quiet gratitude. It's not easy to understand, Tommy. But that's why I tell the stories. Not to glorify what happened, but to remember the people, the ones who didn't make it back. He smiled faintly, as though he were relieved to have finally said it out loud. And maybe, just maybe, you'll take something from it. Tommy sat back in his chair, his mind reeling. He had entered this weekend expecting the same old war stories, but what he had found instead was a deeper understanding of the man his grandfather truly was. It wasn't just about the battles, the missions, or the medals. It was about the bonds formed in the heat of combat, the ones that lasted long after the dust had settled. And now, Tommy realized he was starting to understand the price of those bonds. This weekend was no longer just about hearing stories. It was about beginning to understand them. The drive to Grandpa Jerry's cabin felt longer than usual. With each mile that passed, Tommy's stomach twisted into tighter knots. The air in the car was thick with the hum of conversation between his parents, but Tommy barely registered their words. His thoughts were preoccupied with the upcoming weekend, with the idea of what he was about to face. Another weekend away, another weekend at Grandpa's cabin, tucked away in the woods, surrounded by nothing but nature and silence. But this time, it felt different. It wasn't just the isolation of the cabin or the rustic charm of the place. It was the sense of expectation, a gnawing feeling that something was about to shift. Tommy had been to Grandpa's cabin countless times before, but this time, something felt uncertain, almost unsettling. He couldn't quite explain it, but he had the distinct impression that this weekend would be different from all the others. Maybe it was because of what had happened at the dinner table the night before, when he'd interrupted Grandpa's war story. He couldn't shake the guilt that lingered from that moment. How had he let his frustration take over? Why had he dismissed his grandfather's stories so easily, without ever really understanding why they mattered? His parents, completely oblivious to his inner turmoil, chatted about work and upcoming family events. Tommy zoned out. He stared out the window, watching the world blur by. The closer they got to the cabin, the more his sense of unease grew. He was about to enter a world he didn't fully understand, and it was more intimidating than he could have ever imagined. The cabin loomed ahead, nestled among towering trees, its weathered wooden frame seeming to breathe with the rhythm of the forest. It looked unchanged from last time, solid, unyielding, and timeless. Yet it felt like it was hiding something. Grandpa Jerry was standing on the porch when they pulled up, his broad shoulders square and his weathered face breaking into a wide, welcoming smile. His presence had always been imposing to Tommy, but now, there was something different in the air, a gravity to the old man's gaze that Tommy couldn't ignore. Grandpa was more than just a veteran of the Navy. Tommy had always seen him as an enduring figure, someone who carried his past with pride, but who kept it mostly hidden behind his cheerful demeanor. But now, there was an undercurrent, a weight in the way Jerry stood there, as though the years had accumulated into something Tommy had yet to comprehend. "Welcome, welcome," Jerry called out with his usual jovial tone. But there was something in his voice, a layer of seriousness that Tommy had never noticed before. It wasn't a shift that anyone else would have picked up on, but Tommy could sense it. As he got out of the car, Grandpa pulled him into a hug, slapping him on the back like he always did. But this time, Tommy held on a little longer, sensing that Jerry might be feeling something heavier than usual. As the family unloaded the car and made their way inside, Tommy hung back for a moment, looking at the cabin from a distance. He had always thought of it as a place for vacations, a retreat from the noise of daily life. But today, it felt like something more. It was like stepping into a part of his grandfather's soul, into a world where every object, every detail, had a story to tell. Grandpa's stories weren't just idle chatter. They were tied to this place, to the memories that lived here in the walls. Inside the cabin, it was as familiar as ever. The soft glow of the fireplace cast a warm light across the room, making everything feel cozy and intimate. The smell of pine and wood smoke lingered in the air. Tommy's gaze fell on the old photographs lining the walls, black and white pictures of Grandpa Jerry in uniform, standing alongside other men in navy blues. A shelf stacked with worn books and old mementos from his service. The cabin had always been a place where Jerry kept pieces of his life, but now they seemed like fragments of something more, something Tommy couldn't quite grasp. After they had settled in and dinner was served, Jerry launched into one of his usual stories. As always, he started with a smile, his voice rich with the details of a mission long past, the faces of men Tommy would never meet, the names of places that seemed far removed from the world Tommy knew. But this time, something felt different. Tommy didn't zone out. Instead, he found himself listening, really listening. Back in '69, we were stationed at Da Nang, waiting for orders. It was the middle of the monsoon season, and the weather was worse than usual. But you learn quickly, you learn to live with it. The rain's constant, pouring down in sheets, the mud making everything a mess, but you've got a job to do. Tommy hadn't realized it before, but Jerry's voice had a kind of rhythm to it, a tempo that matched the way he told these stories. There was a cadence, an ebb and flow, like waves crashing against the shore. It wasn't just the words that caught Tommy's attention, it was the delivery. The way Jerry's eyes would light up when he got to a part he wanted to emphasize, or the sudden stillness in his voice when the weight of a memory overtook him. As Jerry spoke, Tommy found himself imagining the scenes in his mind. The torrential downpour, the roar of the helicopters, the men crouching behind makeshift barricades, the tension in the air. Tommy had never really understood what Grandpa meant when he talked about being on missions, about the moments when everything went silent, when you knew the enemy was nearby, waiting. But now, as he sat there, watching Jerry's face change with the emotions that flickered across it, Tommy began to feel the weight of it. It wasn't just a story anymore. It was a window into a life that Tommy had never understood, a world of hardship and sacrifice that had shaped his grandfather into the man he was. The more Tommy listened, the more he began to realize just how little he knew about Jerry's past, and how little he had ever truly asked. After the ambush, Jerry continued, his voice softening, we didn't know if we were going to make it out alive. I remember looking around, seeing the faces of my men, guys I'd trained with, fought beside. And I remember thinking, this is it. This is how it ends. But we made it out, Tommy. We made it out because we had each other. There were moments like that where the only thing you had to hold on to was the man next to you. And when it's over, when you come back, it's never the same. Tommy swallowed hard, trying to process the depth of what Jerry was saying. There was no glorifying war in these words. No hero's banner, no Medal of Honor. Just the raw truth of survival, of friendship, of the constant fight to keep going when everything inside you screamed to stop. Tommy had never thought about war like this, had never thought about it from the perspective of the ones who fought, the ones who lived to carry the memories of battles they couldn't forget. As the evening wore on, Tommy found himself leaning forward, drawn in by the cadence of Jerry's voice, the power behind the words. He was no longer the boy who tuned out when Grandpa spoke of the past. He wasn't just hearing the stories anymore, he was understanding them. And in that understanding, he began to glimpse something far greater than just tales of war. He saw the man behind the medals, the person who had faced unspeakable things and who had come back to try to make sense of it all. The next morning, after breakfast, Grandpa invited Tommy to join him outside for a walk. It wasn't anything special, just a stroll around the property, but to Tommy, it felt like an opportunity. An opening. As they walked through the woods, Jerry pointed out the trails they used to take when he was younger, the places he had camped, the spots where he and his comrades had huddled in the dark during a storm. It was during this walk that Tommy felt the full weight of Jerry's past. The way he moved through the forest, so accustomed to the land, to the silence. The way his eyes would pause over certain landmarks, as if remembering something important. Jerry wasn't just walking through the woods. He was walking through the memories of his life. When they reached a clearing, Jerry paused, looking out over the horizon. The wind was picking up, the trees swaying gently. "You know, Tommy," Jerry said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of years. "Sometimes, the hardest part of war isn't what you see on the battlefield. It's what you don't see. It's what stays with you long after the fight's over. The faces of the ones you lost. The moments you wish you could forget, but can't. That's the real battle. The one that never ends." Tommy stood beside him, processing the depth of what his grandfather was saying. This wasn't just a man telling war stories anymore. This was a man who had lived through things that Tommy could never truly understand, things that had shaped him, things that had left scars. But despite it all, Jerry was still here, still standing, still telling those stories. And for the first time, Tommy understood why. It wasn't to relive the glory days or to seek recognition. It was to remember, to honor the men who had fought beside him, to honor the bonds they had formed, and to make sure that those stories lived on. Tommy had entered this weekend expecting to hear just another war story. What he had found instead was a new understanding of his grandfather, and a glimpse into a world of strength, loss, and survival that Tommy would never forget. The next morning, Tommy woke up early, an unfamiliar feeling settling in his chest. He had never been one to wake up at the crack of dawn during family vacations, especially when there was nothing pressing to do. But something had shifted in him overnight, something intangible but powerful. For the first time, he didn't feel the rush of impatience he usually felt when it came to Grandpa Jerry's stories. He didn't feel the urge to roll his eyes or zone out. Instead, he felt a quiet curiosity, a desire to hear more, to understand more. Tommy had always known that his grandfather had been in the Navy, had fought in wars that spanned oceans and decades, but it had always seemed like another life, something far removed from his own. That night, after Grandpa's story about the ambush in Vietnam, something had clicked in Tommy's mind. There was a depth to Jerry's words that Tommy had never fully understood before. It wasn't just the content of the stories. It was the weight of them. Tommy felt as though he was standing at the edge of an abyss, looking down at a history that was too vast and too heavy to fully grasp. And yet, he wanted to understand it. It wasn't just the military stories that Tommy wanted to hear more of. It was the man behind them. The quiet moments Jerry had lived, the bonds forged and lost, the sacrifices made. Tommy realized that Grandpa Jerry was not just an old man telling war stories for the sake of nostalgia. He was a man who had lived through unimaginable challenges and had emerged with wisdom. It was that wisdom that Tommy now craved. Grandpa Jerry, ever observant, had noticed Tommy's shift. He knew the boy wasn't the same carefree kid he had been the day before. Tommy was different now. He was asking questions, truly engaging in the stories, leaning in as though he understood the weight of each word that left Jerry's lips. That morning, as Tommy sat outside on the porch with a mug of hot cocoa, Jerry joined him. The air was crisp, the sun just beginning to rise over the horizon, casting long shadows over the forest. The peaceful serenity of the moment was almost surreal, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. There was an unspoken understanding between them now. Tommy didn't need to ask more questions. He simply wanted to be present, to absorb whatever Jerry had to share. Jerry was the first to break the silence. He looked over at Tommy, his expression unreadable for a moment. Then, as if choosing his words carefully, he spoke. "You're asking the right questions, Tommy." Jerry's voice was soft but serious. "The stories, they're not just stories. They're memories. They're pieces of me that I've carried with me. You're starting to see that." Tommy nodded, unsure of what to say next. He felt as though he were standing at the precipice of a great understanding, but wasn't quite sure how to leap into it. He wasn't ready for more stories just yet. He needed to take a step back, to reflect. The day unfolded slowly, the two of them falling into a quiet rhythm. They spent hours walking the trails around the cabin, Jerry showing Tommy different landmarks, places where he had fought, where he had lost friends, where he had made memories that would stay with him for a lifetime. Tommy was struck by how familiar these places were to Jerry. This wasn't just land that Jerry had walked through, it was land that held his past, his ghosts. At one point, they stopped by a small stream that ran through the woods near the cabin. Jerry crouched down, his fingers brushing the water, sending ripples across the surface. He stared at the water for a long time, his eyes distant, lost in thought. Tommy stood beside him, unsure of what to do. But he could feel the weight of Jerry's gaze. The silence between them was heavy, charged with meaning. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jerry spoke, but his words were not directed at Tommy. He was speaking to himself, reminiscing. "I remember standing in a place like this," Jerry said, his voice barely above a whisper. "In the jungles of Vietnam. The humidity thick, the air still, not a sound except the beating of your heart. You can feel the tension in the air, like it's going to snap any second. You have to move, but you're so careful. You never know when the enemy's watching, when they're waiting for the right moment to strike. Every step is a risk." Tommy didn't interrupt. He didn't need to. There was something profound in Jerry's words, something that conveyed the tension of those years in a way that no simple story ever could. This wasn't a war story, it was an experience. It was the feeling of living in constant uncertainty, of knowing that death could be right around the corner, and still pushing forward. Tommy couldn't imagine it, but he was beginning to understand. The next few days were a blur of quiet contemplation, of walks in the woods, of moments of shared silence. Tommy began to notice the little things that Jerry did without thinking, the way he would absent-mindedly touch the old Navy insignia on his jacket, the way his eyes would cloud over when he spoke about a fallen comrade, the way he seemed to carry the weight of the past with him even when he wasn't talking about it. Tommy had never truly understood the depth of what Grandpa had been through, but now, he was starting to see it in the way Jerry moved through the world. The old man was carrying an invisible burden, one that Tommy could never fully lift, but that he could, at the very least, begin to understand. It wasn't easy. The more Tommy saw, the more he realized how much of Jerry's life had been shaped by experiences he could never imagine. But that was part of the adaptation, part of the growing process. It was one thing to understand the surface of a story, but it was another thing entirely to begin understanding the emotions, the sacrifices, the silent suffering that lay beneath it. It wasn't just about listening, it was about feeling. Grandpa Jerry noticed Tommy's growing introspection. He could see the wheels turning in Tommy's mind, the way the boy was processing the stories and memories. Jerry had always known that Tommy was intelligent, but this was something different. This was a deeper level of understanding. One evening, as they sat around the fire after dinner, Jerry told a different kind of story. This one wasn't about combat, but about his comrades, the men he had served with, the ones who had become like brothers to him. "War does something to people," Jerry began, his voice uncharacteristically somber. "It changes them. Sometimes it makes you stronger, but sometimes it breaks you. I had friends who came back from the war and never quite made it. Some of them were never the same. Some of them couldn't deal with what they had seen. Others, they carried the weight of it, but they never showed it. Not to anyone." Tommy listened intently, his eyes fixed on Jerry's face as he spoke. This wasn't the usual tale of heroism or battle strategy. This was about the aftermath. It was about the men who had fought and returned to a world that no longer understood them, a world that couldn't see the scars that lingered beneath the surface. "There's a lot people don't understand about war," Jerry continued. The physical wounds are easy to see, but the mental ones? The ones that last forever? They're invisible. And that's the hardest part, to carry them in silence, to keep going, to pretend that everything's normal when it's not. Tommy felt a lump in his throat. He wasn't sure how to respond. All the bravado he had once felt when hearing Grandpa's stories seemed to have melted away. He wasn't just hearing about the past now, he was feeling it, and it was raw, real, and far more complex than he had ever imagined. For the first time, Tommy understood what Jerry had meant by the weight of the stories. It wasn't about the glory of battle or the triumph of survival, it was about the cost. The unspoken cost of war was something Tommy had never truly grasped, and it wasn't until that moment, sitting around the campfire, that he began to understand the complexity of it. And yet, even in the midst of this profound realization, Tommy also saw something else in his grandfather, a quiet strength that had sustained him through all of it. Jerry didn't talk about the war for validation or sympathy.
He talked about it because it was a part of who he was.
It had shaped him, and in a way, it had defined him. But it had also made him resilient, and that resilience was something that Tommy had begun to admire more than he had ever known. That evening, as the fire crackled and the night grew darker, Tommy sat quietly, reflecting on everything he had learned over the past few days. It was hard to imagine a life so different from his own, so fraught with danger and sacrifice. But he realized that his grandfather's stories were more than just memories. They were lessons. They were reminders of the things that truly mattered. And in that moment, Tommy understood that the greatest lesson of all was not about war or heroism. It was about the importance of bearing witness to history, of remembering the past, and of honoring the sacrifices that had been made so that the present could exist. Tommy wasn't just adapting to his grandfather's stories. He was adapting to the weight of their meaning. The journey had only just begun, but Tommy knew one thing for sure. He would never look at Grandpa Jerry the same way again. The weekend at Grandpa Jerry's cabin seemed to stretch on endlessly, but in a way, it was precisely what Tommy needed. He had started the journey with one goal in mind: to hear Grandpa's war stories from a new perspective, to try to understand what had made Jerry the man he was. But as the days passed, Tommy realized that his desire to get the story had become something deeper, more complicated. Now, he wasn't just looking for details about the war or trying to understand Jerry's medals and accolades. He was looking for something more elusive, the heart of his grandfather's experiences, the emotional landscape that had been buried for so long. It was the last morning of the trip when Tommy finally found himself standing at the precipice of what he thought he wanted. They had just finished breakfast, and the cabin was quiet except for the occasional crackle of the fire in the hearth. Tommy sat by the window, looking out at the familiar forest beyond the cabin's small porch. The trees were swaying gently in the wind, the light soft and golden as the morning sun filtered through the clouds. It was peaceful here, the kind of place that seemed to harbor memories of every moment that had come before. But Tommy knew he couldn't stay in this cocoon forever. There was something he needed to ask Grandpa Jerry, something that had been gnawing at him ever since the night Jerry spoke so quietly about the men he had lost. "Grandpa," Tommy began, his voice steady but unsure, "can you tell me about the friends you lost? The ones who didn't make it back?" Jerry was sitting across from him, reading a book, but at Tommy's words he paused. His eyes flickered up from the pages, catching Tommy's gaze. There was no immediate answer, no hasty words or flippant response. Instead, Jerry set the book down gently, his fingers lingering on the edges of the worn leather cover. The silence between them seemed to stretch before him, and for a moment, Tommy wasn't sure if his grandfather would answer at all. "I think it's time you understand some things," Jerry said, his voice low and measured, almost as though he were preparing himself for something painful. There was a weight to the words that Tommy wasn't used to hearing, a quiet solemnity that made the air feel heavier. "But you need to understand something first, Tommy. Sometimes, hearing the truth doesn't make things easier. It just makes you carry more." Tommy nodded. He had expected this answer, but it didn't lessen the pressure building in his chest. He had asked for this, for the stories that would give him a deeper sense of who his grandfather was, for the stories that would finally explain why Jerry's smile always seemed tinged with a faint sadness, why his eyes occasionally grew distant when he thought no one was watching. He had wanted to know about the men Jerry had fought beside, but now that the moment had arrived, Tommy felt a strange reluctance. "Don't worry about me, Grandpa," Tommy said, swallowing hard. "I can take it. I want to know. I need to know." Jerry's expression softened, but his eyes remained shadowed. "You're braver than most, Tommy," he said, his voice gruff, but tinged with pride. "Not everyone asks for the hard truths. Most people spend their lives running from them." The words hung in the air between them as Jerry slowly began to recount the men he had lost during his time in service. For the next several hours, Tommy sat quietly, listening, as Grandpa Jerry spoke of names and faces long buried in the past, names that had once been so familiar to Jerry, so vital to his survival, and yet had been reduced to mere memories in the years that had followed. There was Miller, the young man from Georgia with a sense of humor that could light up the darkest moments. There was Anderson, the quiet, intense man who could read the landscape like a seasoned veteran, even though he was younger than Jerry by a decade. And then there was Franklin, the one Jerry had always considered his closest friend, the man who had kept him grounded when the weight of war threatened to crush him. "He was always there," Jerry said softly, his gaze drifting into the past. "Franklin was the kind of guy who would do anything for you, no questions asked. We went through hell together, Tommy. Saw things most people couldn't even imagine. And when it came down to it, he's the one who saved my life." Tommy's heart skipped a beat. "What happened?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jerry paused, his eyes narrowing as though the memory was too painful to relive. "It was during the siege at Key San. Franklin, he knew I was pinned down. The enemy was everywhere. The moment he saw an opening, he went in. He crawled through the mud, through gunfire, and pulled me out. We were so close to being overrun that day. The artillery was coming in, the bombs were falling, and the whole place felt like it was coming apart at the seams." Tommy's breath caught in his throat, and he leaned forward, trying to absorb the enormity of what Jerry was saying. "But Franklin made it out, right?" he asked, the words tumbling from his mouth before he could stop them. Jerry shook his head slowly, his voice thick with emotion. "He didn't make it out, Tommy. He didn't." Tommy felt a wave of disbelief wash over him. The idea that Franklin, someone Jerry had considered a brother, hadn't made it out of that situation seemed impossible. He wanted to argue, to insist that Jerry was mistaken, but the somber look on his grandfather's face told him everything he needed to know. Jerry had lived through things Tommy couldn't even begin to imagine, and sometimes the truth was brutal. Sometimes the truth was the thing that left the deepest scars. Jerry leaned back in his chair, his gaze distant as he continued. "I carried that with me for a long time. The guilt of it, of knowing that Franklin had died saving my life. I couldn't shake it. I still can't. And there were others too, Tommy. So many others." Tommy's mind was racing, a torrent of emotions flooding his senses. He had come here seeking answers, wanting to understand why Grandpa Jerry was the way he was, wanting to understand the man who had fought for freedom and lost so much in the process. But hearing about the cost of war, about the loss and sacrifice, it was heavier than Tommy had expected. He had expected stories of bravery and heroism, but he hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected to feel the depth of Jerry's grief, the weight of his memories. "I don't know what to say," Tommy said softly, his voice trembling. "How do you even live with something like that?" Jerry's gaze shifted back to him, his eyes dark but understanding. "You don't, Tommy. You don't live with it. You survive. You keep going because that's what you have to do. But you carry it with you every day. It's not a burden you ever set down." Tommy sat in stunned silence, processing the enormity of what his grandfather had just shared. He had asked for the stories, but now that he had them, he wasn't sure he was ready for the weight of them. The reality of war, of loss, of sacrifice, it was something Tommy had never truly understood until this moment. The room felt quieter now, as though the weight of the conversation had settled into every corner. Tommy wasn't sure how to move forward, how to process the flood of emotions that had overtaken him. He wanted to retreat, to escape into the simplicity of the world he knew, to run from the heavy truth that Grandpa Jerry had just laid bare. But something told him that there was no running from this. Not now, not after everything his grandfather had given him. "I think I understand now," Tommy said finally, his voice steady despite the turbulence inside. "I wanted to know the stories, but hearing them, it's harder than I thought." Jerry nodded. "It always is. Knowing the truth doesn't make it easier, but it makes you stronger. And maybe, just maybe, it helps you remember the ones who didn't make it back. It keeps their memory alive." Tommy looked up at Jerry, his eyes searching for understanding. "You're right, Grandpa. I'm not sure I was ready for it, but I'm glad I heard it.
I think
I'm starting to understand why you tell the stories." Jerry smiled faintly, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and sadness. "That's all any of us can do, Tommy. Tell the stories, so they're never forgotten." The weight of that final statement lingered in the air as the two of them sat in silence, the crackle of the fire in the background and the soft rustling of the trees outside the cabin's window. Tommy had come here looking for answers, seeking to unravel the mystery of his grandfather's past. And now, as the weekend drew to a close, he realized that the answers he had found were more complicated than he had ever imagined. He had wanted to understand Jerry's experiences, but now he saw that understanding came with a price, the cost of bearing witness to the painful truths that had shaped his grandfather's life. Tommy had gotten what he wanted, but in the end, he realized that sometimes the most valuable things weren't the easiest to carry. The final day at Grandpa Jerry's cabin arrived too soon for Tommy. It felt like the weekend had passed in a blur. 1 minute, he was standing, in the shadow of his grandfather's past, eagerly devouring each story, and the next, he was left grappling with the weight of those very stories. The night before, Jerry had closed the chapter on the past with a quiet finality, recounting the loss of a dear friend during an operation in the Pacific. The man had been a brother in arms, someone who had been there, sharing laughter and sorrow, and in the end, had fallen beside him in the line of duty. That was the final truth Tommy had heard. Loss, unrelenting and infinite, like a scar that never quite healed. Now, as the morning light poured over the cabin, Tommy sat at the kitchen table, staring down into his coffee mug. The hot liquid, swirling lazily inside the ceramic cup, was nothing more than a distraction from the thoughts that churned in his head. He had asked for these stories. He had wanted to understand the complex man who was his grandfather, who had spent years hiding parts of his past behind his steady gaze and quiet smile. But now that he had it, now that the full weight of Jerry's history had been laid bare before him, Tommy wasn't sure what to do with it. The cold truth was, the stories hadn't brought the clarity he had imagined. He had expected to feel like a grown-up, like someone who had crossed the threshold into the world of the real, someone who understood the burden of history. But instead, he felt overwhelmed, suffocated by a sense of loss he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't the kind of knowledge you could just take in and process in a few days. It wasn't something you could file away in the back of your mind and move on from. It was a living, breathing thing, lingering in the room like smoke that clung to your clothes, your skin, your thoughts. Tommy had heard the stories, yes, but now the faces of Jerry's lost comrades hovered in his mind like ghosts. Franklin's smile, Miller's laughter, Anderson's intensity, all of them frozen in time, immortalized in Grandpa Jerry's words, but gone forever. And what hurt Tommy the most wasn't just the realization that these men had died. It was the understanding that their deaths had shaped Jerry in ways Tommy couldn't fully comprehend. He had entered this weekend seeking answers, eager to understand the man he called Grandpa. But now, in the quiet of the morning, he felt as though he had unlocked a door to a room he wasn't yet ready to enter. The weight of Jerry's past hung heavy in Tommy's chest. He had gotten what he wanted, a deeper connection to the man behind the stories. But now that he had that understanding, it felt as though a part of him had been irrevocably changed. A part of him had been marked by the emotional truth of war, by the loss, by the sacrifice, by the price of survival. Tommy realized, in that instant, that the truth he had so desperately sought had come at a cost he was still struggling to grasp. Grandpa Jerry, however, seemed to have anticipated Tommy's inner turmoil. He had watched his grandson over the course of the weekend, had seen the change in his eyes, the quiet weight that now rested upon Tommy's shoulders. Jerry knew that the boy had entered this weekend with a thirst for understanding, but now he could see the price of that knowledge, the emotional toll it had taken on him. Sitting across from Tommy at the kitchen table, Jerry broke the silence, with his voice low, but firm. "You wanted to know, Tommy. You wanted to understand the stories. But now, you're realizing something that I think we all learn eventually. There's a price to knowing the truth. And sometimes, that price isn't something you can pay and walk away from." Tommy blinked, his throat tight. I thought I could handle it. I thought hearing the stories would make me feel more connected to you. But now I just feel overwhelmed. I don't know what to do with all of this. It's too much." Jerry's eyes softened, and for the first time in the weekend, Tommy saw the exhaustion in his grandfather's face, the weight of years, of memories, of battles fought both on the field and within. Jerry's voice was gentle as he spoke, but there was a rawness in it that Tommy hadn't expected. "You're not supposed to carry it all, Tommy. That's what people like me do. We carry the weight, so the ones we love don't have to. But even we can't carry it forever." Tommy felt the sting of those words, a lump rising in his throat. He had wanted so badly to understand, to be a part of his grandfather's world. But the world Jerry had lived in, had survived, was one Tommy couldn't even begin to fathom. He had asked for the stories, yes. But now, he realized the stories came with a burden that wasn't meant for him to bear. The stories were Jerry's, his to carry, to share, and ultimately, to remember. But Tommy had been drawn into them, and now, it felt as though he was standing on the edge of a precipice, unsure of how to move forward. The cabin felt smaller now, as though the walls were closing in on him. The peaceful sounds of nature outside, the birds singing, the wind rustling through the trees, all of it seemed distant and insignificant in the face of the emotional weight Tommy was carrying. He wanted to run, to escape, to go back to the simplicity of his life before he had heard the stories. He wanted to unlearn the painful truths that had come with them. He wanted to forget the faces of the men Jerry had lost, the ones who would never come back. He wanted to go back to being a kid, someone who could laugh at Grandpa's stories, someone who didn't have to carry the ghosts of the past. But life didn't work that way. The more Tommy thought about it, the more he realized that he had crossed a threshold. There was no turning back now. He had asked to know, and he had learned. The stories had opened up a world he hadn't been prepared for. But that world was now a part of him, whether he was ready for it or not. The hardest part, Tommy thought, was understanding how to live with it. He had been asking for stories about courage, about bravery, and about the valor of his grandfather's generation. But what he hadn't fully understood was that true bravery wasn't just about surviving the war, it was about living with the consequences of survival. It was about carrying the weight of those who hadn't made it home, and learning how to keep moving forward even when the past clung to you like an anchor. Tommy looked up at Jerry, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and sorrow. "I didn't know it would be like this," he said quietly. "I didn't know the stories would make me feel like this." Jerry nodded slowly, as though he had expected this reaction. "No one ever does, Tommy. No one ever expects the stories to come with this much weight. But that's the thing about the past, it never really lets go. It stays with you. And that's what makes it worth remembering. The people who are gone, they're worth remembering." Tommy sat in silence, his mind swirling with everything he had learned. He had asked for the stories, but now he understood what Jerry meant about the price of knowing the truth. Sometimes, the truth didn't set you free. Sometimes, it bound you to the past in ways you couldn't escape. And sometimes, that was the price you paid for understanding. The silence stretched between them for what felt like hours, each of them lost in their own thoughts, the weight of everything hanging in the air like an unspoken truth. Finally, Tommy broke the silence, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do you keep going, Grandpa? How do you live with all of this?" Jerry looked at him, his face hardening slightly as he took in the question. It was a question he had asked himself countless times. How did he keep going after losing so much? After everything he had seen? How did he live with the ghosts that haunted him? "You keep going, Tommy," Jerry said, his voice rough but steady. "You keep going, because that's all you can do. You don't let the past drag you down. You honor it, you remember it, but you don't let it destroy you. You keep going because the people who didn't make it, those men you've heard about, would want you to keep going. They would want you to live." Tommy nodded slowly, the truth of Jerry's words settling in his chest. It wasn't going to be easy, living with the weight of everything he had learned. But he knew, deep down, that this was the price of understanding, the price of connection, the price of honoring the past. And in the end, as he stood up from the table and prepared to leave, Tommy realized that he wasn't just walking away with stories. He was walking away with something deeper, a new sense of responsibility, a new understanding of what it meant to be part of a family, part of a history, part of a legacy that extended far beyond the present moment. It wasn't just about knowing the past. It was about carrying it forward. The drive back home felt different this time, as if the road had shifted beneath Tommy's feet. The landscape outside the car window, which had seemed so familiar, now appeared distant, almost foreign, as though he was seeing it through new eyes. His mother was in the passenger seat, humming along to a song on the radio, but Tommy hardly noticed. His mind was still with Grandpa Jerry, still in the cabin, still lost in the weight of the past that he had learned to carry. It was hard to let go of that final moment at the cabin, where Jerry had spoken his last words about surviving the past, about honoring the dead, and about remembering those who had fallen. As they crossed through the small towns and endless stretches of highway on their way home, Tommy's thoughts drifted back to that final conversation with Jerry. The silence that had fallen between them, the quiet understanding that had settled in the room. His grandfather had always been a quiet man, but Tommy had never seen that kind of silence from him before. It wasn't just the silence of an old man waiting to share a memory. It was the silence of someone who had come to terms with his past, who had lived with his ghosts for years, but still bore them with a dignity that Tommy could hardly comprehend. He thought about the stories now, the faces of those men that Jerry had spoken about, the ones who had gone to war beside him, the ones who had fought and died with a loyalty that Tommy could never truly understand. And the more he thought about it, the more he realized something. The stories Grandpa Jerry had told were not just about the past. They were about the present. They were about the living, about the responsibility that came with the knowledge of the past, and about how to move forward in a world that had changed. Tommy glanced over at his mother, still humming, lost in the comforting routine of the drive. She hadn't been to the cabin, hadn't heard the stories. She didn't know what Tommy had learned, what he had carried back with him. He could tell her, of course, but he wasn't sure he could put it into words. How could he explain what it had felt like to sit in that cabin, to hear those stories, to feel the weight of history pressing down on him? How could he explain the transformation that had taken place inside of him in just a few short days? He wasn't sure he could. When they finally pulled into their driveway, Tommy sat for a moment, his hands still gripping the edge of the seat, his eyes focused on the quiet house in front of him, the place he had called home for so many years. But now, everything felt different. His bedroom felt different, the kitchen, the familiar walls of his house. All of it felt distant, as though he was standing on the outside looking in. He had returned to the same place, but he wasn't the same person who had left. As he stepped out of the car, he could hear the familiar sound of his father's laughter coming from the backyard. His father was always outside, tinkering with the car or working on some project. Tommy's younger sister, Lily, was running around in the yard, chasing after the family dog. The sound of their lives, their carefree lives, washed over Tommy like a distant echo. For the first time, he felt separated from it all. Tommy's mother had already gone inside, but Tommy lingered for a moment, taking in the scene in front of him. He saw the joy in Lily's face as she played, the simplicity of her happiness. He envied her in a way. She didn't know about the weight of history, about the stories that lingered in the past, about the men who had given everything and never returned. She didn't know what Tommy knew now, the cost of survival, the burden of memory. Walking toward the house, Tommy felt as though he had one foot still in the past and one in the present. He could still hear Grandpa Jerry's voice in his mind, still see the faces of the men who had lived and died by Jerry's side. The stories hadn't just been about the war. They had been about life, about living in the shadow of loss, about honoring those who came before. But now, Tommy had to figure out what all of this meant for his own life, his own future. How could he carry the past with him and still move forward? Tommy wasn't sure. But one thing was certain. He couldn't go back to the way things were. Not entirely. That evening, as they sat down for dinner, Tommy found himself quiet, his usual chatter replaced by an introspective silence. His parents and Lily seemed unaware of the shift in him, their conversations flowing around him as if nothing had changed. But Tommy knew it had. They didn't know what he had learned, what he had seen, and they wouldn't understand if he tried to explain.
How could they?
How could anyone who hadn't walked through the doors of that cabin, who hadn't heard Grandpa Jerry's voice speaking of the men he had lost, truly understand? It wasn't until later, when the house had quieted down and Tommy found himself alone in his room, that the full weight of everything hit him. He had carried so many stories in his mind over the past few days, so many faces, so much loss, and now, it felt like his chest might collapse under the pressure. The weight of memory wasn't something he could just set down and forget. It was with him, always. It was in the way he thought about his own life, about his own future, and about what it meant to be part of something greater than himself. Tommy lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, the weight of the past and the present swirling inside him. The faces of Jerry's fallen comrades hovered in his thoughts, but they weren't just faces anymore. They were voices. They were lives, real people who had fought and bled and died so that others could live. And Jerry, Grandpa Jerry, had carried the weight of those men for years. He had never been able to escape it, but he had never let it destroy him, either. Tommy knew he wasn't there yet. He wasn't ready to carry the same weight, to carry the ghosts of the past as Jerry had. But he also knew that the past would always be a part of him. It wasn't something he could erase or forget. It was something he had to learn to live with. And that was the hardest part. The next morning, Tommy made a decision. He wouldn't forget. He wouldn't bury the stories or hide from the past. He would remember, and in doing so, he would honor what his grandfather had shared with him. He might not fully understand it yet, but he would carry it with him, in his heart and in his actions. He would be a living memory of those who had come before him, those who had fought and died for something greater than themselves. Tommy picked up the phone and dialed Grandpa Jerry's number, his hands trembling slightly as he waited for the line to pick up. When Jerry's voice answered, Tommy felt a strange surge of emotion, a mix of gratitude, reverence, and sadness. "Hey, Grandpa," Tommy said softly. "I just wanted to thank you for the stories, for sharing everything with me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line, and then Jerry's voice, thick with emotion, responded. "You're welcome, Tommy. Just remember, don't carry it all on your own. You don't have to." Tommy smiled, a tear slipping down his cheek. "I know, Grandpa. I won't. But I'll carry what I can." As Tommy ended the call and set the phone down, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. He didn't have to have all the answers. He didn't have to solve the mysteries of the past, but he could live with it. He could honor it. And that, he realized, was enough. As Tommy sat by his window later that day, looking out at the quiet street, he understood what Jerry had meant. The past would always be with him, in the stories, in the memories, in the faces of those who had come before. But that wasn't a burden. It was a responsibility. To remember, to carry the weight of the past forward, and to live a life that honored those who had come before. Tommy wasn't just returning to the world he had left behind. He was returning to it as a different person, a person who now understood the true cost of courage, the price of survival, and the importance of remembering. And, for the first time, Tommy felt ready to face it.